$500 million. That is the exact figure. Canada has just released this amount through a single loan program designed to help businesses survive tariffs imposed by the United States. But here's the point that almost no one in the mainstream media is explaining. This has nothing to do with short-term economic defense. It is a calculated strategy of structural transformation, a shift that caught the White House completely off guard and exposed a fundamental weakness in current U.S. tariff policy. Mark Carney, former central banker and now Prime Minister of Canada, promised to protect Canadian jobs while reducing the country's dependence on the United States. On the other side, Donald Trump promised that tariffs would bring Canada to its knees. Reality, however, turned out very differently. In 2026, American consumers began paying an average of $1,300 more per household. Meanwhile, Canada signed 12 new trade agreements across 4 continents in just 6 months. This economic relationship is neither small nor simple. The United States and Canada form one of the most deeply integrated trade partnerships in modern history. Every single day, roughly $2.5 billion in goods and services cross the border. Annual bilateral trade exceeds $1.3 trillion, a figure larger than the GDP of most European countries individually. Supply chains are so tightly interwoven that a single automobile can cross the border up to 8 times during its production. When the second Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs in early 2025, 25% on most Canadian imports and 10% on energy products, the objective was clear: force production back onto American soil and negotiate from a position of absolute strength. To do so, the White House invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a tool normally reserved for sanctions against hostile nations. Canada's response took an unexpected path. Instead of simply retaliating and waiting for negotiations, Carney launched what he called a strategic transformation of the Canadian economy. Drawing on his experience as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, he combined emergency relief with long-term structural changes designed to reduce Canada's vulnerability to U.S. pressure. The numbers speak for themselves. Canada allocated $5 billion to a strategic response fund to help companies adapt to tariffs. The Business Development Bank of Canada received $500 million targeted at small and medium-sized businesses. Farm Credit Canada injected $1 billion into the agricultural sector. Export Development Canada committed another $5 billion over 2 years to support exporters in reaching new markets. In total, federal and provincial programs now exceed $20 billion, one of the largest peacetime economic interventions in Canadian history. Meanwhile, in the United States, the theory behind tariffs began to unravel. The promise was simple: foreign producers would absorb the costs while jobs and revenue returned to America. In practice, the Tax Foundation calculated that this package represents the largest tax increase as a share of GDP since 1993. For households, that translated into an average cost of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026, with a disproportionate impact on lower-income families. The Federal Reserve itself confirmed that tariffs added roughly 0.5 percentage points to overall inflation. Companies initially absorbed part of the cost, but as inventories ran down, prices were passed on to consumers. The core assumption of tariff policy, that trading partners would have no viable alternatives, proved deeply flawed in Canada's case. In 2025, Carney announced an ambitious goal: doubling Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade. Many dismissed it as political theater. The data, however, tell a different story. Exports to the United Kingdom rose by nearly $10 billion. Exports to the European Union increased by more than $5 billion. Oil exports to China surged over 240% following the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Canada also began investing heavily in trade infrastructure, ports on both coasts, railways oriented toward east-west trade, digital customs systems, and new logistics corridors that bypass the United States entirely. In January 2026, Carney traveled to Beijing, marking the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in 8 years. The agreement shocked markets. Canada slashed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to just over 6%, while China sharply reduced tariffs on Canadian agricultural products. The deal opened the door to affordable vehicles for Canadian consumers and provided immediate relief to farmers, while triggering political backlash in Ontario and open criticism from Washington. Days later, in Davos, Carney delivered a speech that went viral. Without directly naming the United States, he said the rules-based international order had suffered a rupture. Tariffs, supply chains, and financial systems were being weaponized. The line that echoed around the world was blunt: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Trump responded angrily, saying Canada lives thanks to the United States. But the data tell a different story. Canada's auto sector suffered severe layoffs as jobs moved south. At the same time, American consumers faced higher prices, fewer choices, and weaker economic growth. Today, Canada is positioning itself as a leader of what it calls the Middle Power movement, signing agreements across Europe, Asia, and South America. A policy designed to force Canada into submission instead accelerated its economic independence. Tariffs meant to protect American jobs ended up costing U.S. families dearly and pushing a historic ally toward new global partners. $500 million in loans, $5 billion in strategic funds, $6 billion in infrastructure, 12 deals across 4 continents, $1,300 per American household, 68,000 jobs at risk in Ontario alone. These are not political talking points. They are measurable consequences, and ordinary people on both sides of the border are paying the price.